April 14th, 1945. The North Sea, 8 miles off the coast of Scotland. Water depth, 200 feet. Inside German submarine U-1206, the crew was preparing for another day of hunting Allied shipping. They had been at sea for 11 days. Their mission: patrol British coastal waters, sink merchant vessels, disrupt supply lines, survive. It was routine work for experienced submariners. The war was clearly lost. Everyone knew Germany would surrender within weeks. But orders were orders. The Kriegsmarine expected its submarines to fight until the bitter end. At approximately 10 in the morning, the submarine's captain, 27-year-old Kapitän-Leutnant Karl-Adolf Schlitt, needed to use the toilet. This should not have been noteworthy. Human beings use toilets. Submarine crews are human beings. Therefore, submarine crews use toilets. This is not complicated. Except on U-1206, it was complicated. Because U-1206 was equipped with the Kriegsmarine's newest, most advanced, most sophisticated toilet system ever installed on a submarine. It was a technological marvel. It was also, as Schlitt was about to discover, a catastrophically dangerous piece of equipment in the hands of someone who didn't understand exactly how it worked. Within minutes of Schlitt using the toilet incorrectly, seawater would flood into the submarine. Chlorine gas would form when seawater contacted the batteries. The crew would be forced to emergency surface directly into enemy waters. British aircraft would spot them and attack. 1 crew member would die. 3 would drown trying to swim to shore. 46 would be captured. The submarine would be lost. Germany's war effort would lose 1 more vessel it desperately needed. And all of this, every bit of it, would happen because the captain didn't know how to properly flush a toilet. This is the story of U-1206, the German submarine that sank because of a toilet malfunction. It is one of the most absurd, embarrassing, and darkly humorous disasters in naval history. It is also a perfect illustration of how complex technology, poor training, and human error can combine to create catastrophe. And it reminds us that in war, death doesn't always come from enemy action. Sometimes it comes from something as mundane as plumbing. To understand how a toilet could sink a submarine, you need to understand submarine toilets in general, and German submarine toilets specifically. This requires understanding why submarine toilets are different from regular toilets, which means understanding the basic problem of human waste disposal in sealed underwater vessels. Normal toilets on land work by flushing waste with water into sewer systems or septic tanks. The water carries the waste away, and gravity does most of the work. Simple, effective, completely impossible on a submerged submarine, because submarines operate underwater, often at significant depths where external water pressure is immense. If you simply opened a valve to flush waste overboard, water pressure would force seawater into the submarine instead of waste going out. The submarine would flood. Everyone would die. So submarine toilets need to work against water pressure, which is not a simple engineering problem. Early submarines dealt with this problem crudely. Some used buckets. Seriously. Crew members would relieve themselves in buckets, which were then emptied overboard when the submarine surfaced. This was disgusting, unsanitary, and terrible for morale, but it worked. Other early submarines used simple holding tanks. Waste went into internal tanks that were sealed until the submarine surfaced, at which point they could be pumped overboard. This was better than buckets, but created other problems. Holding tanks took up valuable space. They smelled terrible. And they could only hold so much waste, limiting how long a submarine could stay submerged. As submarine technology advanced and submarines began spending longer periods submerged, better toilet systems became necessary. Engineers developed systems that could flush waste overboard even when submerged. These systems were complex. They typically involved multiple valves, pressurized air, and precise sequences of operations. Open the wrong valve at the wrong time, and disaster could result. Early submarine crews learned toilet procedures carefully, because mistakes could be fatal. By World War II, most submarines used variations of similar toilet systems. Waste went into a bowl, similar to a regular toilet. When ready to flush, the crew member closed valves separating the bowl from both the interior of the submarine and the ocean. Then they pressurized the bowl using compressed air, forcing the waste through pipes and out through a hull valve into the ocean. The pressure had to exceed the water pressure outside the submarine, or the system wouldn't work. After flushing, the crew member had to depressurize the system, open the right valves in the right sequence, and ensure everything was properly sealed before anyone else used the toilet. It was complicated, but manageable with proper training. Most World War II submarines had only 1 or 2 toilets for the entire crew, typically 40 to 50 men. This created queues and scheduling challenges, but it was workable. The toilets were usually located in forward or aft compartments, away from the control room and other critical areas. Experienced crew members understood the systems. Junior crew members received training. Mistakes were rare because everyone understood that toilet malfunctions could sink the boat. German submarines, U-boats, used similar systems to other nations' submarines. But German engineers, true to their reputation for over-engineering solutions, decided that the standard submarine toilet design wasn't sophisticated enough. They wanted something better, more efficient, more complex, more German. So for the Type 7C U-boats built late in the war, including U-1206, they designed an advanced high-pressure toilet system that could flush waste overboard even at deeper depths than conventional systems. This was genuinely innovative. It was also genuinely dangerous if operated incorrectly. The new German high-pressure toilet system was so complex that it required a specialist to operate. Not every crew member could use it safely. Only trained personnel were authorized to operate the flushing mechanism. When a crew member needed to use the toilet, they would do their business, but then they had to call a specialist, essentially a toilet technician, to come and properly flush the system. This seems absurd to modern sensibilities, but from an engineering standpoint, it made sense. The system was complex enough that improper operation could cause serious problems. Better to have specialists handle it than risk untrained crew members making mistakes. U-1206 was a Type 70C submarine, one of the most common German submarine designs of World War II. Type 70Cs were workhorse vessels, not the largest or most advanced, but reliable and effective. They displaced about 760 tons when surfaced, could make 17 knots on the surface and 7 knots submerged, and carried 14 torpedoes and a crew of approximately 44 to 50 men. They could dive to 230 meters operationally, deeper in emergencies. Over 600 Type 70Cs were built during the war, making them the most produced submarine class in history. U-1206 was commissioned in March 1945, making it one of the last U-boats to enter service before Germany's surrender. The submarine was brand new, equipped with all the latest technology, including the advanced high-pressure toilet system. Its captain, Karl-Adolf Schlitt, was 27 years old and relatively inexperienced as a submarine commander. This was his first patrol as a U-boat captain. He had served on submarines before, but commanding one was different from serving on one. The responsibility was entirely his. Every decision, every order, every life aboard was his responsibility. Schlitt's crew was also relatively inexperienced. Many were young men drafted late in the war as Germany's manpower situation became desperate. They had received basic training, but nothing could truly prepare someone for submarine service except actual experience at sea. And U-1206's crew had very little of that. They were green-capable enough to operate the submarine, but lacking the instinctive understanding of submarine systems that comes only from months or years of service. U-1206 departed Kiel, Germany, on April 6, 1945, for its first war patrol. The mission was to operate in the North Sea and waters around Scotland, hunting Allied merchant shipping and naval vessels. By April 1945, this was essentially a suicide mission. The Allies controlled the seas. Their anti-submarine warfare capabilities had become extraordinarily effective. U-boats were being sunk faster than they could be replaced. Crew survival rates were abysmal. Most U-boats that left port in the final months of the war never returned. The men aboard U-1206 knew this. They weren't stupid, but they had orders, and German military discipline required following orders even when those orders were effectively death sentences. The patrol's first week was uneventful. U-1206 transited through the North Sea, submerging during daylight to avoid Allied aircraft and surfacing at night to recharge batteries and run diesel engines. They spotted some merchant vessels but had no opportunities for attacks. Allied convoys were heavily escorted. Solo merchant ships were rare. The U-boat war that had nearly strangled Britain in 1942 was long over. By April 1945, U-boats were hunted prey, not hunters. On April 14th, U-1206 was submerged off the Scottish coast, approximately 8 miles from Peterhead. The submarine was at periscope depth, about 20 to 30 meters below the surface, cruising slowly, conserving battery power, looking for targets. The crew went about their routines. Engineers monitored systems. Sonar operators listened for enemy vessels. Watchstanders stood their watches. And Captain Schlitt needed to use the toilet. Now, here's where the story becomes both absurd and tragic. Schlitt, as captain, presumably should have known how to operate every system aboard his submarine. But the high-pressure toilet system was new. Schlitt had received some training on it, but he wasn't an expert. He decided to use the toilet himself rather than calling the specialist. Perhaps he wanted privacy. Perhaps he didn't want to bother the specialist with something he thought he could handle himself. Perhaps he was embarrassed to admit he didn't fully understand the system. Whatever his reasoning, Schlitt used the toilet and then attempted to flush it himself. He operated the valves incorrectly. The exact sequence of errors isn't completely documented, but the general problem is clear. Schlitt opened valves in the wrong order, creating a situation where instead of high-pressure air forcing waste out of the submarine, external water pressure forced seawater into the submarine. The toilet effectively reversed, becoming not a waste removal system, but a pipe bringing ocean water directly into the submarine. Schlitt realized immediately that something was wrong. Water started spraying into the toilet compartment. He tried to close valves to stop it, but he didn't know which valves to close, or in what order. Water continued flooding in. He called for the toilet specialist, but by the time the specialist arrived and assessed the situation, significant amounts of seawater had already entered the submarine. This would have been bad enough on its own. Submarines don't do well with uncontrolled water ingress, but the specific location of the flood made it catastrophic. The toilet compartment on U-1206 was located directly above the battery compartment. German submarines used electric motors for underwater propulsion, powered by massive battery banks. These batteries were lead-acid batteries, similar in principle to car batteries, but much, much larger. Lead-acid batteries contain sulfuric acid. When seawater contacts sulfuric acid, a chemical reaction produces chlorine gas. Chlorine gas is extremely toxic. It was used as a chemical weapon in World War I, causing thousands of deaths and horrific injuries. It attacks the respiratory system, causing fluid buildup in the lungs, essentially drowning victims in their own bodily fluids. Even small concentrations cause severe irritation. Larger concentrations kill quickly, And now, thanks to Schlitt's toilet error, seawater was flooding directly into U-1206's battery compartment, producing chlorine gas in an enclosed space with 50 men aboard. The specialist tried desperately to stop the water flow, but the damage was done. Seawater continued to seep into the battery compartment. Chlorine gas began forming. The acrid smell spread through the submarine. Crew members started coughing, their eyes burning, their throats constricting. The submarine's ventilation system, instead of clearing the gas, circulated it throughout the vessel. Everyone aboard was being poisoned. Schlitt faced an immediate decision: stay submerged, and everyone would die from chlorine gas poisoning. Surface and face almost certain attack by Allied forces, but at least give the crew a chance to breathe clean air. There was no good option. Both choices carried enormous risk. But staying submerged was certain death. Surfacing was only probable death. Schlitt ordered the submarine to surface immediately. U-1206 blew its ballast tanks, forcing compressed air into the tanks to expel water, making the submarine buoyant and rose rapidly toward the surface. This was dangerous in itself. Emergency surfacing in hostile waters during daylight violated every submarine survival protocol. Submarines were vulnerable on the surface. They were slow, lightly armed, and easily spotted. The entire point of submarines was to remain hidden underwater. Surfacing during the day off the enemy coast was almost suicidal. But chlorine gas poisoning was definitely suicidal, so Schlitt had no choice. U-1206 broke the surface approximately 8 miles off Peterhead, Scotland. The crew opened hatches, desperately ventilating the submarine, letting the poisonous gas escape and fresh air in. Men staggered onto the deck, gasping, coughing, grateful to breathe. The chlorine gas dispersed quickly in the open air. The immediate threat passed. The crew was safe from poisoning. But now they were on the surface in enemy-controlled waters, in broad daylight, clearly visible for miles. And the British were watching. Shore-based radar stations tracked every vessel in the area. Aircraft patrolled constantly. The Coastal Command of the Royal Air Force had spent years perfecting anti-submarine warfare techniques. They were very good at finding and destroying surfaced U-boats. And U-1206 had just announced its presence by emergency surfacing. Within minutes, British forces responded. Shore stations scrambled aircraft. Coastal patrol vessels altered course toward the submarine's position. U-1206's crew frantically assessed the situation. Could they dive again? No. The battery compartment was flooded and contaminated. The batteries were damaged. They didn't have enough electrical power to dive safely or stay submerged for any significant period. Could they fight on the surface? No. Their deck gun was minimal, and British aircraft carried bombs and depth charges that would obliterate the submarine. Could they escape on the surface? No. U-boats were slow on the surface, and the British were already closing in. Schlitt ordered the crew to abandon ship. It was the only option. Scuttle the submarine so it wouldn't fall into British hands. Abandon ship, and hope for rescue or to swim to shore. The crew opened valves to flood the submarine deliberately, ensuring it would sink rather than being captured. Then they inflated their life rafts and abandoned U-1206. The submarine sank quickly once the crew opened the flooding valves. U-1206 had been in commission for just over a month. It had completed exactly one patrol. It had fired no torpedoes. It had sunk no enemy vessels. And now it was gone, resting on the bottom of the North Sea, 8 miles off Scotland, because its captain had incorrectly flushed a toilet. The crew faced a desperate situation. They were in life rafts in cold North Sea waters in April, water temperature perhaps 8 to 10 degrees Celsius. Hypothermia would set in quickly. Shore was 8 miles away. a grueling distance to swim or paddle in a life raft. British forces were converging on their position. Death from exposure was a real possibility if they weren't rescued quickly. 4 crew members decided to try swimming to shore rather than waiting in life rafts. This was a terrible decision, but desperation makes people do irrational things. Swimming 8 miles in cold water with heavy clothing is nearly impossible even for strong swimmers. These men were submariners, not Olympic athletes. 3 of them drowned. Their bodies were later recovered from the sea. The 4th, somehow, incredibly, made it to shore alive. He was captured immediately by British forces, but he had survived. 1 crew member, the chief engineer, died in the chlorine gas exposure or the chaos of surfacing and abandoning ship. Sources vary on exactly how he died, but he was the only fatality directly aboard the submarine itself. His body went down with U-1206. The remaining 46 crew members, including Captain Schlitt, were picked up by British vessels and taken into prisoner-of-war camps. They spent the remaining weeks of the war as POWs. Germany surrendered less than a month later, on May 8, 1945. The crew members eventually returned to Germany after the war ended. For the survivors, U-1206's loss was deeply humiliating. Being sunk by enemy action was honorable. Being forced to scuttle your submarine because of mechanical failure was unfortunate, but understandable. But having your submarine sink because the captain couldn't properly flush a toilet? That was mortifying. It was the kind of story that would haunt them forever. And indeed, U-1206 became infamous as the submarine sunk by a toilet, a story that spread through naval circles and eventually into historical records. Karl-Adolf Schlitt survived the war and lived for many more decades, dying in 2009 at age 91. He rarely discussed U-1206 publicly. Who could blame him? Losing your first command because of a toilet malfunction isn't something anyone wants to relive. But the story was documented in naval records, interrogation reports of captured crew members, and eventually in histories of submarine warfare. Schlitt couldn't escape it. His name would forever be associated with the most embarrassing submarine loss in German naval history. The wreck of U-1206 was located in the 1970s by offshore oil survey crews operating in the North Sea. The submarine lies in approximately 70 meters of water, resting on its side. British authorities designated it a war grave, prohibiting salvage or disturbance. It remains there today, 79 years after sinking, a memorial to 4 men who died and a testament to how complex technology and human error can combine to create disaster in the most unexpected ways. The U-1206 incident raises several interesting questions about technology, training, and human factors in complex systems. First, why was the toilet system so complex that it required specialists to operate? German engineers designed it for deeper depth operation than conventional systems, which required higher pressure and more precise valve sequencing. This added capability came at the cost of increased complexity. In hindsight, the trade-off wasn't worth it. A simpler system that worked reliably at moderate depths would have been preferable to a complex system that could work at greater depths, but was prone to catastrophic failure if misoperated. Second, why wasn't Captain Schlitt properly trained on the system? The toilet was new technology, installed only on the latest submarines. Training programs hadn't fully caught up with the technology. Schlitt had received some instruction, but not enough to fully understand the system's operation. In an ideal world, every officer would be trained on every system aboard their vessel. But in the chaos of war, with new technology being introduced constantly and training time limited, gaps in knowledge were inevitable. Schlitt's gap in knowledge happened to be fatal. Third, why didn't Schlitt call the specialist instead of trying to operate the system himself? Pride, probably. Embarrassment. the desire to handle things himself rather than admitting he needed help with something as mundane as using a toilet. This is a very human failing. People, especially people in leadership positions, often don't want to admit ignorance or ask for help with things they feel they should know. Schlitt thought he understood the system well enough to operate it safely. He was wrong. That error in judgment cost him his submarine and killed 4 men. Fourth, could the disaster have been prevented even after the initial error? Possibly. If the specialist had been called immediately when the flooding started, he might have been able to close the correct valves quickly enough to limit the water ingress. But precious seconds were lost while Schlitt tried to fix the problem himself. By the time the specialist arrived, enough water had entered the battery compartment to create a dangerous amount of chlorine gas. Those few seconds of delay made the difference between a manageable problem and a catastrophic one. The U-1206 incident is often cited in engineering and safety courses as an example of how complex systems can fail in unexpected ways. Engineers call this normal accidents theory, the idea that in complex systems with many interactive components, accidents are inevitable even when every component works correctly in isolation. The toilet system worked as designed. The batteries worked as designed. The submarine's structure and systems worked as designed. But when human error caused these systems to interact in an unintended way, seawater meeting battery acid, the result was catastrophic. Normal accidents theory, developed by sociologist Charles Perrow, argues that certain types of systems are inherently prone to catastrophic failure because they are both complex, many interconnected parts, and tightly coupled. Changes in one part rapidly affect other parts. Nuclear power plants, chemical facilities, and yes, submarines are classic examples. You can make these systems safer through better design, training, and procedures, but you can never make them completely safe because the fundamental nature of the system creates opportunities for unexpected interactions between components. U-1206 demonstrates this perfectly. The toilet and the batteries were separate systems with no intended interaction. But physical proximity and the laws of chemistry meant they could interact if water flowed from one to the other. The designers presumably knew this risk existed, which is why they required specialists to operate the toilet. But they couldn't eliminate the risk entirely without either relocating the toilet, difficult in a submarine's cramped spaces, relocating the batteries, even more difficult, or using a different battery chemistry, not practical with available technology. The risk was known, managed through procedures, but ultimately still present. When procedures failed, when Schlitt operated the toilet incorrectly, the risk materialized. The U-1206 story also illustrates the role of human factors in complex system failures. Human error is often cited as the cause of accidents, but this explanation is usually incomplete. Yes, Schlitt made an error. But why did he make that error? Because he wasn't properly trained. Why wasn't he properly trained? Because the system was new, and training programs hadn't adapted. Why was the system so complex that extensive training was necessary? Because engineers prioritized performance over simplicity. Why did Schlitt try to operate the system himself instead of calling the specialist? Because organizational culture and personal psychology made him reluctant to admit he needed help. Each of these factors contributed to the disaster. Blaming human error without examining these deeper causes misses the point. Modern safety science emphasizes that accidents usually result from multiple factors aligning in unfortunate ways, what's called the Swiss cheese model. Imagine each safety barrier as a slice of Swiss cheese with holes in it. Most of the time, the holes don't align, so hazards are blocked. But occasionally, the holes align perfectly, allowing a hazard to pass through all the barriers. That's what happened on U-1206. Multiple holes aligned, complex system, inadequate training, personal pride, physical proximity of systems. chemical properties of seawater and battery acid. Any one of these factors alone wouldn't have caused disaster. All of them together did. The U-1206 incident was not unique in the annals of submarine accidents. Submarines have always been dangerous vessels, and toilets have caused problems on other submarines as well. The USS Tang, an American submarine, was accidentally sunk in October 1944 by one of its own torpedoes that malfunctioned and circled back to hit the submarine. 78 men died. But that wasn't a toilet-related incident, just mentioned to illustrate that submarines faced many dangers beyond enemy action. Other submarines did have toilet-related problems. Reports from various navies document incidents where toilet malfunctions caused flooding, though usually not catastrophic flooding that sunk the vessel. U-1206's case was unusual in its severity, and in the specific chain of events: toilet error leading to battery contamination, leading to gas poisoning, leading to emergency surface, leading to loss of vessel. Most toilet failures were embarrassing and messy, but not deadly. The British submarine HMS Trenchant had a toilet incident in 1942 where improper operation caused flooding, but the crew managed to control it without having to surface. An American submarine, USS Skipjack, had problems with its toilet system in the 1970s, decades after World War II, demonstrating that even modern submarines struggle with waste disposal. The issue is fundamental. You're trying to expel something from a sealed container into a high-pressure environment. Physics makes this difficult, and complex solutions to physical problems create opportunities for error. Modern submarines have benefited from decades of engineering improvements and lessons learned from incidents like U-1206. Today's toilet systems are more reliable, more intuitive, and better protected against catastrophic failure. Multiple backup systems exist. Training is more thorough. Safety interlocks prevent dangerous valve combinations, but even modern systems aren't perfect. Submarine crews still receive careful training on toilet operation because the consequences of error, while unlikely to sink the submarine, can still be serious. The U-1206 story has become part of submarine folklore, told in naval academies and submarine training schools around the world as a cautionary tale. The specific lesson varies depending on who's telling the story. Engineers emphasize the dangers of over-complex systems. Training officers emphasize the importance of thorough training on all equipment. Safety experts emphasize the need for multiple barriers against catastrophic failures. Psychologists emphasize how cognitive biases and organizational culture affect decision-making. Everyone can find lessons in U-1206's fate. For historians, U-1206 represents a footnote to the larger story of Germany's submarine war against the Allies. By April 1945, Germany had lost the submarine war decisively. Over 700 U-boats had been sunk during the war, with approximately 30,000 submariners killed, a 75% casualty rate, one of the highest of any military service in any nation during World War II. U-boat crews in the war's final months knew they were unlikely to survive. They fought on anyway, out of duty, discipline, belief in their cause, or simply because they had no choice. U-1206 was one of the last U-boats lost before Germany's surrender. Its loss didn't affect the war's outcome. Germany was already defeated, the submarine war already lost, but for the 4 men who died and the 46 who became POWs, the loss was deeply significant. Their lives were disrupted or ended not by heroic combat, but by a mundane mechanical failure. There's something particularly cruel about that. Warriors expect to die in battle. They don't expect to be killed by toilets. The absurdity of U-1206's loss shouldn't obscure the genuine tragedy. 4 men died. 4 families lost sons, husbands, fathers, brothers. Those deaths weren't less real or less painful because they resulted from a toilet malfunction instead of torpedo attack. The widows and orphans left behind grieved just as deeply. The absurdity is for us, looking back from 80 years' distance, blessed with the perspective that lets us see dark humor in tragedy. For the people living through it, there was no humor at all. Captain Schlitt bore the burden of his error for the rest of his life. He made a mistake, a stupid mistake, a preventable mistake, and 4 men died because of it. He lost his submarine on its first patrol. His naval career was over before it really began. He carried that guilt for 64 years, until his death in 2009. We can't know what he thought about during those decades, whether he replayed the incident in his mind, whether he wished he had just called the damn specialist instead of trying to handle it himself. But it's hard to imagine he didn't think about it often. The surviving crew members also carried their own burdens. Survivors of any disaster often experience guilt about surviving when others died. Why them and not me is a question with no good answer. The U-1206 survivors knew their submarine hadn't been destroyed by brave enemy action, but by an error so stupid it became a joke. They had to live with being part of that joke, being the men who served on the submarine sunk by a toilet. Some probably found humor in it eventually. Others probably never did. U-1206's story has been told and retold in various forms over the decades since the war. Magazine articles, history books, documentary films, and internet articles have all covered the incident. The story appeals to people because it combines several elements that make for compelling narratives: World War II history, submarines, technological failure, human error, dark humor, and tragedy. It's the kind of story that sticks in memory precisely because it's so unusual and absurd. But the story is also sometimes misreported or exaggerated. Some versions claim the entire crew died, which is false. Only 4 died and 46 survived. Some versions exaggerate the complexity of the toilet system or the captain's incompetence. Some versions turn it into pure comedy, ignoring the genuine tragedy of the deaths. The historical record is actually well documented from German naval archives and British interrogation reports of captured crew members, so careful historians can reconstruct what actually happened versus what legend claims happened. The technical details of exactly how Schlitt misoperated the toilet are sometimes unclear in sources. Different accounts give slightly different explanations. The most common explanation is that he opened valves in the wrong sequence, but the exact sequence of valve operations isn't always specified. This is partly because detailed technical diagrams of the toilet system aren't readily available, and partly because the surviving crew members probably didn't fully understand the technical details themselves. They were submariners, not sanitary engineers. They knew the toilet broke and the boat flooded. The precise mechanical details were someone else's problem. What is clear from all accounts is the causal chain. Captain uses toilet. Captain attempts to flush toilet. Captain operates system incorrectly. Water enters submarine instead of waste. Exiting submarine, water floods battery compartment. Seawater and battery acid react to produce chlorine gas. Gas spreads through submarine. Submarine forced to emergency surface. Submarine vulnerable on surface. Crew abandons ship. Submarine scuttled. 4 men die. 46 captured. Each link in this chain was necessary for the disaster to occur. Break any one link: better training, calling the specialist, quicker response to flooding, batteries located elsewhere, different battery chemistry, being able to dive again, and the outcome might have been different. This kind of counterfactual thinking is natural when examining disasters. What if? Questions are irresistible. What if Schlitt had called the specialist? What if the flooding had been contained before reaching the batteries? What if they had surfaced in darkness instead of daylight? What if British forces hadn't spotted them so quickly? What if the men who tried to swim to shore had stayed with the rafts? Any of these alternatives might have produced a better outcome, but in reality, none of them happened. The disaster proceeded along its actual historical path, and 4 men died as a result. Interestingly, U-1206 wasn't the only German submarine to have serious problems with the new high-pressure toilet system. Reports from other Type 7C submarines with the system mention difficulties, malfunctions, and crew complaints. The system was apparently more trouble than it was worth. After the war, when submarine historians examined German submarine technology, the high-pressure toilet system was generally judged to be an example of over-engineering solving a problem that didn't really need solving, adding complexity that created new problems, prioritizing technical sophistication over practical reliability. This gets at a broader pattern in late-war German military technology. German engineers in many fields pursued technological sophistication and advanced performance, even when simpler, more reliable solutions would have been more effective. The Tiger tank was mechanically complex and maintenance-intensive compared to Soviet T-34s, which were simpler and more reliable. German jet aircraft were technologically impressive, but difficult to maintain and flew relatively few missions. V-2 rockets were engineering marvels, but killed more people in their production, slave labor in concentration camps, than they killed as weapons. German military technology was often impressive, but sometimes impractical. The high-pressure toilet system fit this pattern. It was impressively engineered. It solved a real problem, allowing waste disposal at greater depths. But the added complexity created new risks, required specialized training, and apparently wasn't reliable enough to justify the benefits. A simpler system would have been better. But German engineering culture valued technical sophistication, so complex systems were developed even when they probably shouldn't have been. This isn't to say German engineers were incompetent, far from it. German engineers produced many excellent designs during the war, but they sometimes let perfectionism and pursuit of technical superiority override practical considerations. This was a cultural tendency that affected many German military programs. U-1206's toilet system was one small example of a larger pattern. After the war, submarine development continued in various navies. The lessons learned from World War II submarines, including toilet-related lessons, influenced post-war designs. Nuclear submarines, which could remain submerged for months, required even more sophisticated waste management systems. Modern systems use vacuum toilets similar to those on aircraft, combined with holding tanks and processing systems. These systems are highly reliable, thoroughly tested, and extensively documented. Modern submariners still receive training on their operation, but the systems are designed to be much more forgiving of operator error than U-1206's system was. The U.S. Navy, in particular, paid close attention to submarine habitability in post-war submarine designs. They recognized that crew comfort and safety affected performance and morale. Reliable toilet systems might seem trivial compared to weapons and propulsion, but they matter enormously to crew well-being. A submarine where the toilets don't work properly is a submarine with an unhappy crew, and unhappy crews perform poorly. So modern submarine design takes these minor systems seriously. The story of U-1206 has found new audiences in the Internet age. The incident is frequently mentioned in articles about unusual historical events, strange military disasters, and examples of how small errors can cascade into major failures. Reddit threads, YouTube videos, and history blogs have all covered the story. For many people learning about it today, U-1206 is their introduction to the broader topic of submarine warfare in World War II. The memorable, bizarre nature of the incident serves as a gateway to deeper historical interest. Educators have also used the U-1206 story as a teaching tool. It's engaging enough to capture students' attention, and it illustrates important concepts in engineering, military history, and human factors. The story can be used to teach about World War II, submarine technology, safety engineering, the importance of training, decision-making under pressure, and many other topics. Its very absurdity makes it memorable, which makes it pedagogically valuable. But using U-1206 as a teaching tool requires sensitivity to the tragedy involved. It's easy to focus on the absurd elements, toilet sinks, submarine, and forget that real people died. Good educators present the incident as both darkly humorous and genuinely tragic, helping students understand that history involves real people whose lives and deaths matter, even when the circumstances seem absurd from a distance. The location of U-1206's wreck, approximately 8 miles off Peterhead, Scotland, places it in waters that see significant maritime traffic. Oil platforms, fishing vessels, and cargo ships regularly pass over or near the wreck site. Modern sonar occasionally detects the submarine's remains. Divers have not been allowed to visit the wreck because it is a designated war grave. British law protects military wrecks as memorials to those who died, particularly wrecks with human remains inside. U-1206 likely still contains the remains of the chief engineer who died during the disaster, making it a tomb as well as a historical site. The designation of shipwrecks as war graves is an interesting aspect of maritime history and law. Many nations recognize that shipwrecks where crew members died are essentially underwater cemeteries deserving protection and respect. This principle applies to both military and civilian vessels. Disturbing these wrecks is considered disrespectful to the dead and is often illegal. U-1206 is one of thousands of protected wreck sites around the world, each representing lives lost to war or disaster. For the families of the 4 men who died in the U-1206 disaster, the submarine's wreck is their loved ones' final resting place. 3 of the 4 died trying to swim to shore, so their bodies were recovered and presumably buried. But the chief engineer went down with the submarine and remains there still. His family has a grave site they can visit, a section of the North Sea marked on charts as the location of U-1206. It's not the kind of grave with a headstone and flowers, but it's a place associated with their loss, and that has meaning. The 4 men who died in the U-1206 disaster were the chief engineer, who died from chlorine gas exposure or in the chaos of abandoning ship. His name appears in German naval casualty records, though different sources sometimes list different names due to record-keeping variations. He was the only fatality directly associated with the submarine itself, rather than the abandonment. 3 crew members who attempted to swim to shore rather than waiting for rescue in life rafts. Their names are also recorded in casualty lists. They drowned in the North Sea before reaching land. Their bodies were recovered from the water and presumably returned to their families for burial. These 4 men were in their 20s, as most submarine crew members were. They had families, friends, dreams, and futures that were cut short. They died not in combat, but because a toilet malfunctioned and a series of decisions led to their being in the water in conditions they couldn't survive. Their deaths were no less final than deaths in combat, but they lacked the consolation of having died heroically. They died absurdly, which makes their deaths harder to memorialize or find meaning in. This raises philosophical questions about death in war. We generally accord special respect to those who die in combat, treating them as heroes who sacrifice themselves for their country or cause. But what about those who die in accidents, mechanical failures, or mishaps? Are their deaths less meaningful, less worthy of commemoration? They were serving in the military, accepting the same risks as those who died in combat. They were in harm's way because of the war. Does it matter whether they died from enemy fire or from a toilet malfunction? Philosophically, probably not. Death is death. The grief is the same. The loss is the same. The courage required to serve on submarines in wartime is the same whether you die heroically or absurdly. But psychologically and culturally, we do make distinctions. Heroes who die in combat get memorials and stories told about their bravery. People who die in accidents get footnotes. This seems unfair, but it reflects deep-seated human needs to find meaning in death, to believe that sacrifices serve purposes larger than random chance. The crew members of U-1206 were serving their country in wartime. They accepted the risks of submarine service, which were enormous. They didn't choose how they would die. That choice was made for them by circumstances: a complex toilet, inadequate training, human error, chemical reactions, cold water. Their service was real, even if their deaths seem absurd. They deserve to be remembered with the same respect as any other military casualties. Captain Karl-Adolf Schlitt lived with the consequences of his error for 64 years after the incident. He survived the war, returned to Germany, and built a life in the post-war years. Germany's recovery from the war was difficult. The country was divided, occupied, economically devastated, and morally reckoning with the Holocaust and other Nazi crimes. Former military personnel had to navigate complex social and legal landscapes. Some faced prosecution for war crimes. Others were simply trying to survive and rebuild. Schlitt, as far as records show, was not accused of war crimes. He was a submarine officer who made a terrible mistake that cost lives. But mistakes aren't crimes. He had been fighting in a war started by his country's criminal regime. But individual submarine officers weren't usually held responsible for the regime's crimes unless they personally committed atrocities. Schlitt's service was simply service, neither particularly heroic nor particularly criminal. Except for the toilet incident, he would have been just another U-boat officer among thousands. But the toilet incident defined his place in history. Whenever U-1206 is discussed, Schlitt is mentioned as the captain who sank his submarine by misusing a toilet. This must have been a heavy burden to carry. Imagine having your greatest failure become the one thing people know about you. Every time someone tells the U-1206 story, Schlitt's error is recounted. His name appears in books, articles, and now internet posts, always associated with this embarrassing disaster. Did Schlitt regret not calling the toilet specialist? Almost certainly. Did he replay the incident in his mind, wishing he could change his decision? Probably. Did he wonder what his life would have been like if he had made a different choice that morning? How could he not? These are natural human responses to having made a decision with catastrophic consequences. But we should also recognize that Schlitt was a 27-year-old submarine captain in April 1945, operating in enemy waters, knowing Germany was losing the war, responsible for 50 men's lives, dealing with complex technology he didn't fully understand. He made a bad decision under stressful circumstances with imperfect information. This doesn't excuse the error, but it provides context. Armchair critics, 79 years later, can easily identify what he should have done. In the moment, with incomplete training and the pressure of command, he made the choice that seemed reasonable to him. It was wrong, but understandable. One interesting aspect of the U-1206 story is how it has been received differently by different audiences over the decades. For German veterans, especially submarine veterans, it was likely a source of embarrassment and dark humor, the kind of story that circulates among those who served, told with shaking heads and wry smiles. For Allied veterans, it was probably a source of satisfaction and mockery evidence of German incompetence, ammunition for psychological warfare. During the war, Allied propaganda could have used the incident to demoralize German forces. Your U-boats are so poorly designed they sink themselves. But by April 1945, the war was nearly over, and propaganda efforts were winding down. The incident didn't become widely known until after the war, when historians examining German naval records discovered it. For post-war audiences, particularly in the 1960s through 80s, when World War II history became popular in books and documentaries, U-1206 was an amusing anecdote that broke up the grim seriousness of war histories. Books about submarine warfare would include a chapter or paragraph about U-1206, providing comic relief amid accounts of depth charge attacks and torpedo runs. For modern audiences, particularly Internet audiences, U-1206 is often presented as pure, absurdist humor. LOL's submarine sank because toilet, with less attention to the tragedy involved. This reflects how Internet culture often treats historical events as memes, focusing on the most shareable, memorable, bizarre elements while stripping away context and nuance. Historians have a responsibility to present the U-1206 story accurately, acknowledging both its absurd elements and its tragic dimensions. Yes, it's darkly funny that a toilet sank a submarine. But 4 men died. 46 others became prisoners. An expensive military vessel was lost. These consequences were real and serious. Responsible historical presentation balances humor with respect for the human cost. The technical details of U-1206's toilet system remain somewhat obscure because detailed engineering diagrams apparently weren't preserved or made publicly available. We know the system existed, know it was complex, know it required specialist operation, and know it could be operated incorrectly with catastrophic results. But the exact valve arrangements, pressure specifications, and operational procedures aren't well documented in accessible sources. This is frustrating for engineers and technical historians who would like to understand precisely what made the system so dangerous. Was it genuinely poorly designed, or just poorly understood by its operators? Could it have been redesigned to be safer? Were there obvious safety improvements that German engineers overlooked? These questions can't be fully answered without access to technical documentation that may no longer exist or may be buried in archives. What we can say is that the system was complex enough to require specialized training, and that training was apparently insufficient for at least some submarine officers. This suggests either that the system was unnecessarily complex or that training programs were inadequate. Probably both were true to some degree. German submarine crews in late 1945 were increasingly rushed through training as casualties depleted experienced personnel. Corner cutting in training likely contributed to incidents like U-1206. The broader context of Germany's situation in April 1945 also matters for understanding U-1206's loss. By this point, Germany was clearly defeated. Soviet forces were fighting in Berlin. Western Allied forces had crossed the Rhine and were deep into German territory. The Reich was collapsing. Everyone knew the war was lost, yet German military forces continued fighting, continued sending men into combat, continued accepting casualties for a cause that was already doomed. U-1206's patrol in April 1945 was essentially pointless from a strategic perspective. One more U-boat attacking Allied shipping wasn't going to change the war's outcome. Germany's submarine fleet had been defeated years earlier. The April 1945 missions were simply going through motions, fighting because military discipline required fighting, dying because the regime hadn't surrendered yet. The crew members of U-1206 knew this, or should have known it. They went on patrol knowing they were unlikely to achieve anything meaningful and very likely to die. They went anyway, because orders were orders, because military discipline was drilled into them, because they didn't know what else to do. And some of them died, not because their mission accomplished anything, but because a toilet broke. This is perhaps the deepest tragedy of the U-1206 story. The deaths weren't just absurd in their immediate cause, toilet malfunction, but also in their larger context. These men died for nothing, in a lost war, on a mission that couldn't succeed, because of an accident that shouldn't have happened. Layer upon layer of futility and waste. Yet we should be careful about imposing our judgment on the choices these men made. They lived in a time and place where refusing military orders meant death by execution. They had been raised in a culture that valued obedience and duty. They may have genuinely believed in their cause, or they may have simply been trying to survive. We can't know their inner thoughts. What we know is that they served. They tried to complete their mission, and some of them died when circumstances overwhelmed them. The U-1206 incident remains relevant today as a case study in complex system failures. Modern engineers studying human factors, safety, and reliability analysis often examine historical disasters to understand how failures occur and how they can be prevented. U-1206 appears in this literature as an example of how multiple small failures, inadequate training, complex interfaces, poor emergency response can cascade into catastrophe. The incident is also relevant to discussions about technology and human limitations. We can build incredibly sophisticated systems, but those systems still need to be operated by humans with human limitations. If a system is so complex that users can't reliably operate it safely, that's a design problem, not just a user problem. Good design accommodates human limitations rather than expecting humans to be perfect. Modern design principles emphasize simplicity, intuitive operation, clear feedback, and forgiveness of errors. Systems should be designed so that common mistakes either can't happen, prevented by physical design or software interlocks, or have minor consequences, failure modes that are safe or recoverable. U-1206's toilet system apparently violated these principles. It was complex, non-intuitive, required precise operation, and had catastrophic failure modes. A better design would have made Schlitt's error impossible or inconsequential. Of course, it's easy to critique historical designs with the benefit of hindsight and 80 years of engineering advancement. The engineers who designed U-1206's toilet system were working with the technology, materials, and knowledge available in the early 1940s. They were also working under wartime pressures, with limited time and resources, trying to solve a genuine problem. They may have recognized the risks, but accepted them as unavoidable given the constraints they faced. Still, the incident demonstrates that sophisticated technology isn't always better than simple technology. Sometimes the most advanced solution creates more problems than it solves. This lesson applies beyond submarine toilets to many domains where engineers must balance performance, complexity, reliability, safety, and usability. Often, the best solution is not the most technologically sophisticated, but the most appropriate for the context and users. The human element of the U-1206 story is ultimately what makes it memorable and meaningful. Technology failed, yes, but humans were making the decisions throughout. Humans designed the system. Humans trained the crew. Humans operated the submarine. A human made the error. Humans dealt with the consequences. At every stage, human choices and human limitations shape the outcome. This is true of most disasters. Technology doesn't fail in a vacuum. It fails in a context of human organizations, human decisions, human errors, human attempts to respond. Understanding disasters requires understanding both the technical details and the human factors. U-1206 is a perfect illustration of this interplay. As we reach the end of this long examination of U-1206's story, what lessons should we take away? Several suggest themselves. Complex systems require thorough training. Don't put people in charge of equipment they don't fully understand. Pride and embarrassment can be deadly. Ask for help when you need it, even if it seems embarrassing. Small errors can have catastrophic consequences in tightly coupled systems. Design systems with multiple barriers to prevent cascades of failure. Absurdity and tragedy can coexist. Something can be darkly funny and genuinely sad at the same time. Individual lives matter in historical events. The 4 men who died on U-1206 were real people, with families and futures, not just statistics. Technology should accommodate human limitations, not expect human perfection. The context of decisions matters. Judge historical actors by the information and constraints they faced, not by what we know in hindsight. And perhaps most fundamentally, war creates circumstances where people die for trivial reasons, because they're in dangerous situations they wouldn't otherwise be in. The real tragedy isn't that a toilet malfunctioned. The real tragedy is that 50 men were at war, in a submarine, off an enemy coast, where a toilet malfunction could kill them. The story of U-1206 has now been told in full detail, perhaps more detail than it has ever been told before. From the technical aspects of submarine toilets to the biography of Captain Schlitt, from the chemical reaction that produced chlorine gas to the philosophy of death in war, we've examined this incident from many angles. The story is simultaneously absurd and tragic, humorous and heartbreaking, instructive and cautionary. U-1206 rests at the bottom of the North Sea, 8 miles off Scotland, a steel tomb for 1 man and a memorial to 4 men's deaths. The submarine's story has outlived everyone who sailed on it. Karl-Adolf Schlitt, the last surviving crew member, died in 2009. The final direct witnesses to the incident are gone. We're left with the historical record, the documentation, the stories passed down, and the wreck itself. The submarine that sank because of a toilet remains one of history's most unusual military losses. It serves as a reminder that war kills in many ways, that human error has consequences, that complex systems fail in unexpected ways, and that sometimes history is stranger and more absurd than fiction could be. 4 men died. 46 became prisoners. 1 submarine was lost, all because a captain didn't know how to properly flush a toilet. May the 4 men who died, the chief engineer and the 3 who drowned attempting to swim to shore rest in peace. May we learn from their deaths. And may we remember that behind every historical anecdote, no matter how absurd, there are real human lives, real human deaths, and real human consequences.